Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking aim at one of the most persistent and honestly one of the most opaque aspects of modern statecraft, regime change.
It's a term that's loaded with meaning.
It really is. And when you hear it, your mind probably jumps to the big, obvious military invasions, right?
Yeah.
Like Afghanistan in 2001 or Iraq in 2003. The kind of thing that dominates the news for years.
Exactly. Those are the high-profile examples that really stick in the public consciousness. But if you actually dig into the historical record, particularly the systematic study by Lindsey that covers the entire Cold War, well, the picture changes dramatically.
How so?
History shows that states, especially the great powers, very, very rarely resort to outright declared war to topple another government. It's too costly, it's too visible, and the diplomatic mess it creates is enormous.
So what you're saying is the big invasions are actually the exception, not the rule.
They are the massive exception. Which brings us to this sort of ultimate paradox we're going to explore today. The U.S. knew that covert action had a really low success rate, but they still preferred it something like 10-to-1 over an overt war.
Okay, that's the core of it right there. Our mission for this deep dive, then, is to cut through all the speculation, the conspiracy theories that always surround this topic, and get right down to the hard data. We're diving into O'Rourke's systematic analysis of U.S. interventions between 1947 and 1989, which she calls America's secret Cold War.
And the data point that just immediately leaps out from her research, it's really the core finding we'll be using to frame this whole conversation, is frankly staggering.
Go on.
O'Rourke's dataset reveals a scale that's hard to wrap your head around. During that period, the United States launched 64 covert regime change attempts.
64?
64. And in that same period, only 6 overt interventions.
Wow. 64 covert actions. That isn't just an occasional tool you pull out when you're desperate. That was the default. It was the first choice, 10 times more common than sending in the Marines.
It was standard operating procedure.
So for you listening, our goal today is to unpack 3 core areas here. First, the causes. Why did the U.S. pursue this strategy so relentlessly, even knowing the risks?
And the conduct. How did they actually manage these operations, or try to manage them? What was the tactical thinking behind choosing secrecy over strength?
And third, and this is maybe the most surprising part, the long-term consequences. Because as we'll detail, they almost never aligned with what the policymakers were hoping for.
Right. So we should probably start with the most fundamental question, the one that drives so much of international security policy.
Which is?
If all-out war is so risky, and other tactics like, say, coercion or sanctions often don't work, what makes regime change so appealing to leaders despite all the obvious costs?
And the answer, I'm guessing, isn't just about ideology.
No, it's rooted in security strategy. But specifically, it's about the potential for permanence.
Okay, let's unpack that, the idea of permanence. Because normally you have negotiation, you have sanctions, coercion.
Right, all tools that only temporarily change a government's behavior. They're just treating the symptoms, not the underlying disease.
So if you threaten a country, they might comply for a little while, but their fundamental interests haven't changed.
Exactly. If a foreign leader still fundamentally opposes your policy, you are perpetually stuck bribing them or threatening them or sanctioning them over and over and over again just to maintain compliance. It's an ongoing, expensive commitment.
The constant pressure campaign.
It is. But regime change. Regime change promises to alter the underlying preferences of that foreign government, not just its behavior.
Oh, because you're literally changing the person or the group holding power.
You're swapping out the leadership. It's like switching the operating system on a computer, hoping you get a clean slate with no viruses.
That's a great analogy.
Think of it like a franchise model. If you're successful, the government you install will pursue its own self-interest. But because you've chosen them carefully, their self-interest is now aligned with your core needs.
So they do what you want them to do, but they do it because they want to do it. You don't have to force them every single time.
Precisely. The foe is, in theory, transformed into a reliable client state, a friend. And that potential, the idea that you can fundamentally transform a difficult, expensive relationship into a cooperative one, that's the core security rationale. Policymakers saw it as the ultimate shortcut to a cheaper, more permanent solution.
So to really understand the different motives driving all this, O'Rourke's research breaks down all 70 of these interventions, the 64 covert and the 6 overt, into 3 really clear categories.
Right. 3 ideal types that detail how the U.S. was trying to increase its relative power in that global competition with the Soviet Union.
Let's start with the most aggressive one.
That would be what she calls offensive operations. The goal here was to overthrow a current military rival or break up a rival alliance. This is the classic policy of rollback.
So this isn't about maintaining the status quo. This is actively trying to change the balance of power.
It's overtly revisionist. You're trying to weaken your adversary.
Yeah.
And we see 23 covert and 2 overt missions that fall into this category.
And when you say rollback, I immediately think of the Reagan era, but the research points to 2 distinct waves, right?
It does. The first wave began almost immediately after World War II in the late 1940s, as the Soviet threat was really consolidating. And the goal was incredibly aggressive.
Well, what are they trying to do?
They were actively trying to weaken the USSR by supporting secessionist and dissident movements inside the Eastern European satellite states and even inside the Soviet Union itself.
Wow. So places like Albania, Poland.
Albania, Poland, the Ukrainian SSR, the Baltic states. The hope was to basically fragment the entire Soviet bloc, which would increase America's relative military power and give them strategic territory in case a hot war ever broke out.
But those early efforts are pretty famous for being spectacular failures, aren't they? The whole idea of supporting some resistance fighters in Poland from thousands of miles away against the full might of the Red Army, it just seems, well, wildly optimistic.
It was, and the reality check came very, very quickly. The Soviets had perfected totalitarian police state surveillance. Their counterintelligence was incredible. It was just nearly impossible for U.S.-backed agents to operate or for any real dissident movement to get off the ground.
So Washington learned a hard lesson.
A very hard lesson. They realized how incredibly difficult it was to overthrow a consolidated Soviet ally through covert means, and so they largely backed off from these aggressive offensive operations until much, much later in the Cold War.
The second wave.
The second wave, starting in the late 1970s when the Soviet system itself started showing cracks. And that's when you see the big pushes in places like Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Poland.
Okay, that makes sense. So that brings us to the second category, preventive operations. This sounds more like what we traditionally think of as containment.
Precisely. This was the bread and butter of the U.S. Cold War effort. The goal here wasn't to attack a current rival, but to maintain the status quo, to stop a state, often a non-aligned or newly independent one, from taking actions that could pose a future threat.
Specifically, joining the Soviet alliance.
That was the big one, joining the Soviets or developing some kind of strategic military capability. It was all about blocking communist expansion, and this was the largest category. 25 covert missions and 1 overt one.
So this is the classic domino theory in action. Consolidate your own sphere of influence and stop the dominoes from falling.
Initially, yes. The focus was on ensuring the security of the big allies in Western Europe, and that involved classic election interference.
How so?
Covertly backing moderate and right-wing pro-American parties in these huge, crucial democratic elections in France, Italy, and Japan in the late 40s and 50s, all to block what they saw as potential communist electoral victories.
And as the Cold War map expanded, the targets shifted, I assume.
Absolutely. The focus moved heavily into the global south, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa. That's where the new battlegrounds were.
And some of the most famous cases fall under this category.
They do. The infamous 1953 coup that ousted Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. He was nationalizing the oil industry, which Washington saw as a huge threat to Western interests. But the official security rationale was preventing Iran from drifting into the Soviet camp because of all the internal instability.
Right. And there were others.
Oh, yes. The failed attempt to oust Indonesia's leader Sukarno in 1958. And then the deeply tragic and actually inadvertent assassination of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963.
Inadvertent. The U.S. backed the coup, though.
They backed the coup, absolutely. They hoped it would stabilize the anti-communist war effort. But they didn't explicitly order Diem's assassination. He was killed by the Vietnamese generals in the process.
And that Diem case is just an incredible example of unintended consequences. The U.S. wanted stability, but as the source details, the coup did the exact opposite. It completely destabilized the country politically and led directly to a massive U.S. military escalation.
It's a perfect illustration of how quickly these things can go off the rails. The shadow of that failure really hung over subsequent policies for years.
Okay, so that leads to our final category, which feels a little different: hegemonic operations.
Right. This isn't strictly a Cold War strategy in the same way. It's more of a recurring pattern of regional dominion, and it's rooted in long-standing U.S. policy.
The Monroe Doctrine. We're talking about the Western Hemisphere, primarily.
Correct, dating all the way back to 1823. The core goal here is pretty simple. acquire or maintain hegemony over a specific region, and make sure the states in that region remain politically subordinate. This secures military, political, and economic benefits for the U.S.
And the numbers here are significant too. 18 covert and 3 overt operations, making the Western Hemisphere the single most intervention-prone area.
By far.
So was the only driver here anti-communism, or were there other things at play?
It was a bit more nuanced. The interventions were designed to prevent two types of problems that could threaten U.S. regional dominance. First, yes, the rise of hostile governments seen as sympathetic to communism. Think of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in '54, or Salvador Allende in Chile in '73.
People who might challenge the U.S.-led economic and political order in the region.
Exactly. But second, and this part is crucial, the U.S. sometimes sought to remove unpopular repressive dictators.
Wait, remove dictators who are on their side?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
People like Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic or Papadoc Duvalier in Haiti. Their continued brutal rule was seen as a source of instability. The fear was that their repression would spark popular revolutions that the Soviets could then exploit.
That is a fascinating distinction. So they weren't just fighting communists. They were sometimes preemptively getting rid of a terrible dictator to protect their own long-term stability and hegemony.
It's a classic realpolitik calculation. You sacrifice a short-term authoritarian ally to prevent a long-term radical revolutionary foe from emerging in your backyard.
Okay, so given these massive potential benefits, this promise of turning a foe into a permanent friend, you have to ask, why didn't the U.S. just intervene everywhere all the time?
Because it's incredibly high risk. And so two necessary conditions, two prerequisites, had to be met before policymakers would even consider choosing regime change over something like sanctions or negotiation.
The first one has to do with the nature of the conflict itself.
Right. It's what the research calls a chronic, irreconcilable divergence of interests. These are intractable disputes, the kind where if the target government complies with what the U.S. wants, they basically jeopardize their own hold on power.
So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. If they give in to the great power, they risk being overthrown by their own people.
Exactly. Imagine the U.S. demanding that a leftist regime abandon its core platform of nationalizing resources and embrace a free market agenda. Doing that would instantly alienate their entire base of support. It's political suicide.
So they choose to resist the U.S. because giving in is just as dangerous, if not more so. And that makes tools like sanctions or coercion totally useless.
Useless. Because the leaders simply can't afford to back down. The costs of compliance are internal and absolute. For many of these leaders, the cost of abandoning their core beliefs was far higher than the risk of resisting the U.S. And at that point, regime change becomes the only way, in the eyes of U.S. policymakers, to break the gridlock.
And the second prerequisite is just purely pragmatic. You have to have a plausible political alternative available.
You can't just create a power vacuum. You need a replacement. Someone who is strong enough to not only overthrow the target, but just as importantly, to govern afterward.
And they have to be on your side.
That's the most important part. As O'Rourke points out, if all the plausible replacements are just going to behave like the leader you just got rid of, there's absolutely zero strategic benefit to risking an intervention.
And the research shows that U.S. officials really struggled with this. It wasn't always easy to find someone who was viable, capable, and would reliably toe the U.S. line.
It was not. And the difficulty of finding that plausible alternative often dictated the timing and the very nature of the intervention itself.
And this search for a reliable replacement also explains something really controversial, a finding that just completely contradicts the public narrative of the Cold War.
You're talking about the pragmatic, non-ideological approach to regime type.
I am. Because you'd expect the U.S., the leader of the liberal democratic free world, to only install other democracies. But the data tells a completely different story.
It absolutely does. The U.S. supported authoritarian forces in a staggering 44 out of 64 covert missions.
44, that's more than 70% of the time.
Over 70%. And in fact, in at least 6 documented operations, the U.S. actively sought to replace liberal democratic governments with illiberal authoritarian ones.
Right.
Because the democratic process was delivering leaders who challenged U.S. interests.
But how did policymakers square that circle? They're publicly fighting the Soviets in the name of liberty and freedom. Yet the data shows they're overwhelmingly installing military strongmen, juntas, and personalist dictators.
Because the policy was pragmatic, not ideological, the decision was always always based on which group would best pursue U.S. interests and provide stability.
Democracy was a secondary concern, or not a concern at all.
It was an optional extra. The influential diplomat George Kennan captured this cold calculus perfectly back in 1948. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, "It is better to have a strong regime in power than a liberal one if it is indulgent and relaxed and penetrated by communists."
Wow. So they just redefined what a viable regime was based purely on strategic necessity. Alignment and stability were everything. Okay, so the decision to intervene is made. The U.S. overwhelmingly chooses secrecy, that 10-to-1 ratio we mentioned. Now we have to turn to the conduct. Why did the calculus so heavily favor minimizing cost, even when they knew it meant accepting a higher risk of failure?
It really all boils down to one simple mechanism: plausible deniability. Covert action drastically lowers the potential costs across all three major categories of international conflict.
Let's break this down. First, the security costs.
Right. If the U.S. can successfully deflect blame onto, say, domestic opposition forces, they immediately lower the risk of direct military retaliation from the target state, or even more importantly, from the Soviet Union.
That was the big fear, triggering a direct confrontation with Moscow.
Absolutely crucial. U.S. planners were constantly calibrating the risk of exposure to avoid a costly response. The source highlights this 1953 directive, NSC 174.
And an NSC directive, for our listeners, comes from the National Security Council. It's high-level policy.
Exactly. And NSC 174 was critical because it warned U.S. officials against incitement to premature revolt. Essentially, it told them not to promise aid that could provoke a massive Soviet response that the U.S. couldn't possibly support in time. Secrecy was a tool to manage that risk.
Okay, so that's security costs. Then there are the material costs. This one seems obvious.
Covert ops are just exponentially cheaper than overt military action. And we should really emphasize the scale of this using the source's estimates, all adjusted to $2015 to make it comparable.
Let's hear the numbers.
The cost difference is just staggering. The Iran coup in 1953 cost somewhere between, say, $900,000 and maybe $178 million, depending on how you calculate it. The massive Bay of Pigs invasion in '61 cost about $370 million.
Okay, those are big numbers, but now compare them to an overt war.
Right. Grenada in 1983, a tiny operation against one of the weakest states in the world. That cost $321 million. The Panama invasion in '89, another quick, decisive victory, cost $314 million. And those numbers don't even begin to touch long-term occupation costs.
And that's where the real savings come in. The Pottery Barn rule.
Yeah.
You break it, you own it.
And you have to rebuild it. Covert action completely avoids that massive post-intervention reconstruction cost. The best example is Afghanistan.
You're talking about the covert aid to the Mujahideen in the 1980s. That was the most expensive covert mission of the entire era.
It was about $6.6 billion. Now, contrast that with the price tag of the 2001 overt invasion to overthrow the Taliban.
Yeah.
In the 16 years after that overt invasion, the U.S. spent over $763 billion just on rebuilding the country, training forces, and stabilizing the government.
$763 billion versus 6.6.
That vast disparity is the single biggest reason why policymakers were willing to accept lower odds of success. Secrecy offered a massive savings that could be funneled back into domestic programs or other foreign priorities.
And finally, you have the reputational costs. This is about maintaining an image.
It was the perfect tool for hypocrisy. It allowed the U.S. to maintain a public image as a defender of sovereignty and international law, even while secretly violating those very principles all over the world.
It let officials lie to the American public and to Congress.
It did. As George Kennan noted, it shielded all the unsavory details from the public because the American people might not approve of the methods necessary to, as he put it, fight fire with fire.
And the source has this perfect, cynical quote that captures this. It's from 1970. An exchange between Henry Kissinger and Secretary of State William Rogers about the coup planning in Chile.
I know the one. Rogers asks about the risk of blowback, and he says the only question is how one defines backfire.
And Kissinger replies, getting caught doing something.
That's it, right there. The whole point of secrecy wasn't about morality. It was about avoiding the political cost of exposure.
Which leads us directly to the core tactical dilemma. Policymakers knew they were accepting a higher risk of failure for that lower cost. And the data proves it, right?
It does. Covert ops generally fail more often. We're talking a 39% success rate compared to a 66% success rate for overt military actions.
So why? Why did they fail so often? The source points to three critical recurrent problems with clandestine operations.
The first is a structural problem we touched on earlier. Size versus secrecy. You just can't have both. A large-scale operation, the kind you need to topple a consolidated, powerful state, is almost impossible to hide.
So the need to maintain deniability directly hamstrings your ability to actually succeed.
It does. The Bay of Pigs is the textbook example. To overthrow Castro, they needed a massive force. But to maintain the pretense that the U.S. wasn't involved, they had to use this tiny, poorly equipped force launched from Guatemala.
It was doomed from the start.
The CIA's deputy director, Richard Bissell, later said that deniability was the albatross around the necks of agency planners. They compromised their operational capabilities so completely that failure is almost guaranteed.
Okay, so that's the big structural problem. Secondly, there are these internal dysfunctions, what the source calls recurrent errors, caused by the secrecy itself.
The pathology of neglect.
Explain that.
Well, the need for absolute secrecy meant that policy making was confined to a very, very small group of people, sometimes just 6 to 12 individuals on a committee.
So you bypass all the normal checks and balances, the debate, the different viewpoints.
All of it. You lose the marketplace of ideas that might have warned you about, say, threat inflation or poor planning or just wildly naive assumptions. It creates logistical ambiguity. Orders are relayed through euphemisms to maintain need to know.
So the people on the ground who might actually know better get ignored.
Precisely. We see cases where CIA analysts on the ground who knew the local political climate strongly objected to the plans, but they were just steamrolled by the small group in Washington.
Which means operations were pursued even when they had a very low chance of success.
A marginal probability of success, as one report put it. Kissinger himself acknowledged the plan to block Allende in Chile had maybe a 1 in 10 chance, but the internal environment of secrecy encouraged these flawed assumptions.
And the third reason for failure is target defense. The targets weren't just sitting there, they learned.
They learned to coup-proof their regimes. They'd fill critical military and security posts with hyper-loyalists. They'd create parallel intelligence agencies to spy on the main ones. They'd purge anyone who seemed like a potential threat.
So over time, it just got harder and harder to infiltrate and manipulate these governments.
Much harder. Which helps explain why the success rate for coups, specifically, declined so significantly after 1973. The developing world got better at defending itself.
Given all this, the massive cost advantages of secrecy, the 6 overt cases really stand out. When did the U.S. decide it was worth it to fully expose its hand and risk all those costs and public backlash?
It was only when the strategic stakes were overwhelming and the cost of covert failure was simply unacceptable.
And we have to remember, in 4 of those 6 cases, the overt action only came after a covert attempt had already failed.
That's a critical piece of context. Lebanon, the Dominican Republic, Libya, Panama, they all saw a covert action fail first. The U.S. was basically forced to commit publicly when the situation spiraled out of their control.
So what were the triggers that led to that escalation?
There are basically 3. First, they only went overt when a decisive victory was expected, when policymakers believed they could secure a quick, decisive military win against a very weak foe.
Grenada in 1983, a classic example. The U.S. military was something like 200 times larger than Grenada's. They knew they could win, and win fast.
Second trigger, time pressure. Sometimes a crisis would unfold so rapidly that the slow, careful setup for a covert operation just wasn't practical.
Like a civil war breaking out.
Exactly. Lyndon Johnson's intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965. A civil war erupted, and the U.S. felt it had to act immediately to prevent what they called a second Cuba scenario from taking root.
And the third trigger?
Signaling resolve. Sometimes the very visibility of the action was the point. It was used as a deliberate strategic signal to deter rivals and counteract the domino theory.
So Eisenhower's 1958 Lebanon intervention.
Yes. That was driven, in part, by fear of losing regional influence after a coup in Iraq. They needed to send a message to signal their willingness to fight to maintain the credibility of U.S. power in the region. The visibility wasn't a drawback. It was the goal.
Okay, let's get into the real granular detail now, the nuts and bolts of how these 64 covert missions were carried out. The success rates varied wildly depending on the tactic.
They really did. O'Rourke's work breaks it down into 5 main types, and we can go from the least successful to the most.
Let's start at the bottom, the most controversial and, I imagine, the most dangerous in terms of blowback.
Assassinations. And the data here is definitive. A 0% success rate across 5 documented attempts.
0. Even though 2 foreign leaders were, as we said, inadvertently killed during U.S.-backed coups.
But direct, planned assassinations failed every time. The famous attempts against Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba. The Church Committee in the 70s famously concluded that assassination had no place in America's arsenal, but they kept trying.
Why, if it never worked?
Because the objective, just removing the one leader, was seen as the quickest, cheapest path to a security goal. But it failed because of the operational difficulty. You need absolute certainty of death. You have to control volatile foreign assets. The operational security required is almost impossible to maintain covertly.
Okay, next up the ladder. Supporting dissidents. Secretly funding revolutionary or secessionist movements. This is the most common tactic.
The most common, yes. Attempted 35 times. But it had a dismal 12% success rate, only 4 successes.
And why did this one fail so often?
Primarily because it required far too much material support to remain truly covert. If the dissidents were weak, the U.S. had to provide enough arms and money to make them decisive, but doing so would blow their cover.
So they were caught in a trap.
A total trap. Provide enough aid to win, and you risk provoking Soviet retaliation. Provide too little aid, and the whole effort just fizzles out and fails quietly. Those early attempts to back secessionists in the Ukrainian SSR were doomed from the start for exactly that reason.
All right, now let's pivot to the more successful end of the spectrum. Sponsoring coup d'etat. This one had a remarkable success rate.
A 69% success rate, 9 successes out of 13 attempts.
That's incredibly high. It was one of the most reliable, covert tools in the box. What made coups so effective?
They worked best against 2 specific types of targets. First, democracies.
I like democracies.
Because they're open political systems, they lack that institutionalized coup-proofing we talked about. Their security forces are designed to be subordinate to the civilian government, not to spy on them. That made it much easier for the CIA to find, fund, and coordinate with military officers willing to strike.
And the second target type?
Weak personalist autocracies. These regimes are inherently fragile. They rely on the loyalty of one single person or a tiny clique, not on a stable party or institution. If you remove that central figure, the entire political system can just collapse.
But you mentioned that success rate declined over time.
It did, significantly after 1973, as those developing states learned their lesson and started investing heavily in counterintelligence.
And that brings us to the most successful tactic of all, election interference. An incredible 75% success rate, 12 out of 16 attempts.
And this just makes perfect sense in the context of secrecy and plausible deniability. It's the easiest tactic to conceal. You're just transferring funds, spreading some propaganda through foreign media assets, providing advice. It's financially tiny compared to a coup or an invasion.
But there's a big analytical catch here, isn't there? It's really hard to know for sure if the U.S. action was actually the decisive factor.
Absolutely. That 75% rate is statistically significant, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. In many cases, like backing moderate parties in Italy and Japan in the late 40s, the U.S.-backed parties were already leading in the polls before the covert aid even arrived.
So the U.S. might have just been backing a winner that was going to win anyway?
It's very possible the aid was entirely superfluous, a way to ensure a victory that was already coming. However, in other cases, like Chile in 1964, the U.S. spent upwards of $20 million on a single campaign. That's about $8 per voter. In that case, the covert money was almost certainly instrumental.
Okay, and finally there's democracy promotion, which we mostly associate with the later Cold War.
Right, and this saw a 50% success rate, 4 out of 8 attempts. This was a more subtle tactic, using what you might call pseudo-covert mechanisms like the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, in the 1980s.
The stated goal was to foster democratic institutions, free press, unions, political parties.
But the underlying strategic objective was the same as always. Install pro-American elites and prevent communist or socialist victories, even if those groups were operating democratically. The pragmatism was still there. The NED explicitly supported moderate and right-wing groups and avoided socialist ones. The security motive was still driving the bus, just under the guise of democracy promotion.
This brings us to the ultimate paradox of this whole thing, the illusion of secrecy. If the success rate was only 39%, and we know that over 70% of the targets publicly accused the U.S. of meddling at the time, then plausible deniability was often a complete delusion.
It was.
So why? Why go to all the expense and hassle of maintaining the charade of a pseudo-covert operation?
Because the choice isn't a simple binary between covert and overt. It's a continuum. And even when an operation is partially exposed, when everyone kind of knows what's going on, maintaining the official denial still minimizes critical costs.
How does it minimize costs if everyone knows you're lying?
Well, first, political cost. Pseudo-covert conduct dramatically reduces media scrutiny compared to an overt invasion. The details are underreported. Only a really dedicated, informed segment of the public is even aware it's happening.
The Iran-Contra affair is a good example.
A perfect example. Only 54% of Americans even knew the U.S. was backing the rebels in Nicaragua, and only 32% could correctly find the country on a map. Public awareness was so diluted, which limits political pressure.
And it gives the White House huge advantages domestically, letting them skirt things like the War Powers Act.
Exactly. Covert actions are distinctly presidential powers. By maintaining deniability, the executive branch keeps its speed and flexibility, bypassing all the checks and balances required for overt military action. It's the difference between a secret slush fund and a massive public war appropriation bill.
And most importantly, you said it helps both sides avoid escalation.
Yes, this is a crucial point. A former CIA agent explained that an avowal of responsibility, the U.S. publicly saying, yes, we are fighting you, is seen by the enemy as a direct threat, one that might require them to retaliate forcefully to save face.
But if it's pseudo-covert,
then both sides can pretend. By supplying the Afghan Mujahideen with Stinger missiles but officially denying it, the U.S. allowed both itself and the USSR to feign ignorance. It's a tacit convention that lessens the pressure for both superpowers to escalate a proxy war into a direct, hot war.
That's fascinating. You're keeping secrets for the enemy, but why would the target state ever agree to play along with such an obvious charade?
Well, they often had their own reasons, usually related to domestic control. First, they might let the charade continue while they try to infiltrate the U.S. operation with their own spies. Second, they might wait to reveal it on their own terms to maximize their political leverage.
Like the Soviets with the spy planes.
Exactly. They shot down 13 U.S. reconnaissance planes between 1950 and 1964. But they only publicized the one involving Francis Gary Powers because it served their political goals at that moment.
And the third reason ties back to that pragmatic Cold War policy. It's about domestic optics.
Correct. The target government might prefer not to acknowledge the operation because doing so would expose their own domestic weakness. If Moscow admitted the U.S. was successfully backing a massive resistance in Ukraine, it would reveal how fragile Soviet control really was. By feigning ignorance, the state avoids responding to an embarrassing challenge and minimizes the chances of military escalation. It's a complex game.
So we've established that states chose this path as a supposedly cheap, low-risk way to turn foes into stable friends. They were willing to trade a high success rate for low costs. Which brings us to the final, crucial question. Did that central promise of permanence and stability ever actually hold up?
In terms of overall short-term success, the answer is a pretty qualified no, with that 39% success rate. But if you break it down by who the target was, a very clear and honestly a very disheartening pattern emerges.
Which is to say, the U.S. was best at intervening in the places where it needed to the least.
Precisely. The easiest targets were weak states, democracies, and, believe it or not, American allies. Missions against U.S. allies succeeded 69.6% of the time.
Almost 70%.
These were the operations, as the source puts it, least needed from a geostrategic perspective. They often involved states already well within the American sphere of influence, like Guatemala or the Dominican Republic. The U.S. faced almost no external threat when intervening in these places, which made success relatively easy.
And in stark contrast, the hardest targets, the ones that actually represented a real security threat, were the Soviet allies.
And operations against Soviet allies succeeded only 10.3% of the time. These were those offensive rollback missions that pitted American-backed forces directly against Soviet military power. Because the U.S. couldn't provide decisive support covertly without risking massive escalation, these efforts almost always failed. The desire for deniability strategically constrained them.
So the ideal covert operation for the U.S. was a coup against a weak, democratic ally. The worst possible candidate was supporting dissidents against a powerful, authoritarian Soviet ally.
That's it in a nutshell.
But success isn't just about toppling the government. It's about whether the new regime reliably pursues U.S. interests and, just as importantly, stays in power. It's about that permanence you mentioned at the start.
And this is where the core theoretical flaw of the whole enterprise, the principal-agent problem, really shows up in practice. The U.S. is the principal, the new leader is the agent.
But the new leader, the agent, they don't operate in a vacuum.
Not at all. They're immediately faced with the exact same geopolitical and political pressures that plagued their predecessor. The country's geography hasn't changed, its economic realities haven't changed, its population's beliefs haven't changed, just because the leader did.
So the U.S. creates a puppet, But the puppet immediately realizes it's still being pulled by these powerful local strings that are often stronger than the strings coming from Washington.
Correct. And this led to two major outcomes for the leaders the U.S. installed. First was defiance. The new leaders would just balk at U.S. demands. For instance, a military strongman who promised to privatize industries would quickly realize that actually doing so would cause massive strikes and riots that threatened his hold on power. So he'd start behaving just like the guy the U.S. overthrew, just to survive.
And the second outcome?
Dependence. The leaders would pursue U.S. interests, but only because they were highly dependent on massive amounts of U.S. military and financial aid to stay in power.
And that dependence becomes its own vulnerability.
A critical vulnerability. It fueled domestic opposition, who would label them as U.S. puppets, which made them incredibly vulnerable to internal coups or revolutions. The U.S. had essentially created a fundamentally unstable client state that needed continuous foreign support just to exist.
And the consequence of that instability is, well, it's shocking. Approximately half of all leaders installed by U.S.-backed covert regime changes were violently removed later on.
Half of them. Assassinated, overthrown in another coup, or toppled by a revolution, and crucially, these subsequent violent turnovers often installed regimes that were even more hostile to the U.S. than the original target government had been.
You can see that in South Vietnam after the Diem coup.
A perfect example. It led to a series of short-lived, ineffective U.S.-backed military juntas. None of them could consolidate power, which ensured the U.S. was drawn deeper and deeper into the conflict with no stable, reliable partner on the ground.
So, beyond the instability of the new regimes, the data also completely debunks that core operational assumption that covert action prevents conflict. If 70% of the targets knew they were being meddled with, the security risk wasn't reduced at all. It was just deferred.
And when you try to do business with foreign leaders who know you're actively trying to remove them, well, unsurprisingly, it increases the likelihood of what's called a militarized interstate dispute, or an AD.
And for our listeners, an AD is basically a conflict short of a declared war, border clashes, intense diplomatic threats, that sort of thing.
Right. And this is where the data gets truly startling. The statistical analysis, which controls for pre-existing conflict risk, provides a very clear answer.
And that is?
States that were targeted for covert regime change were 6.7 times more likely to experience a militarized interstate dispute with the U.S. in the following decade.
6.7 times more likely to get into a fight with the U.S. It's like if you tried to secretly poison your neighbor and failed, you're almost 7 times more likely to get into a fistfight with him later that year. The intervention itself became the spark for future conflict.
It was the spark, not the solution. And a failed intervention, specifically, strongly and significantly increased the likelihood of a future Med-B. It soured diplomatic relations, it reduced the target's voting similarity with the U.S. at the UN, and it increased their foreign policy similarity with the Soviet Union.
So the failure actively pushed the target state right into the arms of your main rival.
It's the worst possible outcome. You pay the cost of the intervention, you fail to get what you want, and you make the security situation even worse by creating an actively hostile new foe.
And the negative consequences didn't just stop at the state-to-state level. They extended deep into the domestic stability of the targeted countries.
They did, raising profound questions about the long-term strategic wisdom of these operations.
Let's look at the link to civil war. That's a massive societal cost.
U.S.-targeted states were significantly more likely to experience a civil war afterward. The probability nearly doubled, jumping from a baseline of about 20% to almost 40% for targeted states.
Wow.
And the risk was highest for the failed interventions. They saw a 41% likelihood of civil war in the following decade. The intervention itself destabilized political institutions, polarized domestic politics, and just created grievances that made armed conflict far more probable.
What about that stated goal of promoting democracy? Was there any positive ideological impact in the long run?
Sadly, no. The interventions did not have a consistent or statistically significant positive effect on a country's level of democratization. While there were a few individual cases that worked, the negative impact of those 6 missions that explicitly targeted functioning democracies and installed autocracies effectively canceled them out. The net result was neutral or often negative for political freedom.
And finally, the most chilling consequence the source examines, the link to mass killings.
Targeted states were statistically more likely to experience adverse regime changes or human rights abuses, specifically mass killings, compared to similar countries where the U.S. didn't intervene. This strongly implies that the covert action, even when pursued with pragmatic security intentions, often led to the collapse of state institutions or the establishment of new, repressive regimes willing to use mass violence to consolidate power.
So this deep dive into America's secret Cold War, it reveals this crucial systemic pattern. Policymakers consistently and dramatically overestimated the benefits of secrecy, and they just as dramatically underestimated the long-term cascading costs of failure.
That initial promise of covert regime change, a cheap, permanent solution to a security threat, it rarely materialized, and it often created far worse problems down the line.
The key takeaways seem undeniable. A high failure rate of 61%, the delusion of plausible deniability with a 70% exposure rate, and the primary negative consequence being that these actions did not reliably install friendly, stable regimes.
Instead, they often led to more conflict, more domestic instability, civil war, and human rights abuses, with the U.S. itself being 6.7 times more likely to get into a fight with the very state it just targeted. It is a remarkable record of unintended consequences.
The material savings were huge, but the indirect costs, the anti-American sentiment, the loss of trust, the sparking of greater violence were consistently catastrophic for the stability of the global system.
And this record of failure leads us back to our opening theoretical question. The fact that states pursued regime change for these core security motives, overthrowing rivals, establishing hegemony, that's all consistent with classic realist theories of international relations. But this research forces us to address a deeper challenge to that framework.
So what's the final provocative thought we can leave the listener with as they process all this secret history?
Well, many prominent realist theories famously black box the state. They argue that domestic politics are basically irrelevant because states will always behave based on their geostrategic position and their relative power, regardless of who's in charge.
But that's not what the U.S. did.
Not at all. The U.S. devoted immense resources and risked international war 64 separate times, explicitly to change who led a foreign government. They acted as if political leadership mattered more than geography or military capability. If your objective is simply maximizing national power, why would you risk so much to change the person holding the reins?
It's a fundamental contradiction.
It is. The sheer frequency and consistency of covert regime change throughout the Cold War suggests that, contrary to a lot of realist theory, policymakers profoundly believe that domestic leadership and political preferences do matter fundamentally to international security. That belief drove the secret history of the Cold War. The question that remains is, was that belief warranted, given the instability they so often left behind? Something for you to mull over.